if you've had the opportunity to take the new basic flow routine in person from myself or one of the other instructors, or if you've done one of the other flow classes, then you have an experience that at some point, cross your fingers, in that class, in that experience, you had just a moment where you stopped thinking. You were no longer aware of the cueing even, or the movements. You stopped worrying about where your hands were, where your feet were. You stopped even being aware of enjoying yourself. It was just an in-the-moment experience. Now, in most likelihood, you weren't aware of it at the time. That kind of thing happens like in hindsight, like all of a sudden you go, oh my God, that was so cool. Right then there, I was not thinking. And then you're like thinking again. But that moment when you weren't thinking, when you weren't trying, when you didn't care what it looked like and you were just doing it, that is what we call the moment of flow. And the entire point of Tai Chi Fit is to get people into that experience, to have them experience that moment. And then little by little, as you work with them more and you have them in your classes longer and longer and longer, that experience lasts longer and it goes a little bit deeper. And that is the entire purpose of being a Tai Chi Fit instructor, to get people to bring out that flow state. So, the first thing we want to do in the training is understand this whole phenomenon. What is flow? How does it happen? Where does it come from? And by understanding a little bit better, we'll be able to figure out whether or not our technique of leading a flow class is working. So let's take a look at a little slideshow about flow. So in the theory of flow, we first want to establish that it's not about the movements. The movements are just a tool, right? We could theoretically pick any kind of movement anywhere, dance or tribal rhythms or anything at all like that, and make that into our motion that brings out flow. But in fact, we choose Tai Chi for a very specific reason. It's because Tai Chi is designed for generations, for hundreds of years, to bring people into this state. All the movements and the postures and the theories and the principles behind it have all been sort of evolving constantly to get more and more efficient at bringing people into a flow experience. Moreover, movements take a lifetime to perfect, to just get a little bit better at, to understand more and more. And there's no amount of training that will, give you the movements, especially in, 100 hours or 1,000 hours even. That's an ongoing process, and it's why we have a mandatory continuing education program in Tai Chi Fit. So it's not about the movements themselves. It's about something a little bit deeper. It's not about a style of technique. It's not about, a style of Tai Chi of a certain family, right? In fact, in Tai Chi Fit, we draw from all the different styles of Tai Chi and Qigong and some additional related kinds of martial arts from Chinese martial arts family. We bring them all into our repertoire because they all work in this way. So the focus of this training, of this 100 hours, is to get you into the basics of the theory of flow and the philosophy of flow and the technique of educing, which means to bring out and then to maintain and to restore flow. So let's start by defining what flow is. What is it? Give it a basic definition. And in the most simple sense, flow is movement, right? When something is in motion, it can be said to have a quality of flow. And when something stops moving, when movement is no longer apparent, you can say that flow is interrupted, right? So if a thing like your body or your chi energy or even your thoughts are in motion, then they're flowing. And when they stop moving, they're not flowing. Make sense? Okay. But further, we're going to say that we're not going to just accept any kind of movement as being flow. There's some kinds of motion that we would say is not flowing, right? You can kind of just see that in nature itself. So we're going to say that what we're looking for is a particular kind of movement, or movement that has particular characteristics. And these characteristics, we would say it would be continuous, in other words, without any breaks, harmonious, meaning that it's smooth and pleasant, and synergistic, which means it brings together as much of the different parts of the body as possible. And not just the body, but also the body connected with the mind, and the body and the mind connected with the energy and the spirit. Right? Now, I also, for the purpose of this lesson, want to introduce some new terms to you. Because I think this will help us to identify some more subtle distinctions in the theory of flow, and consequently will help us understand what we're looking at when we're assessing how flow is working in during our classes. So the first pair of terms comes to us from the work of a man named Rudolf Laban, who lived in Europe around the turn of the 20th century. So Laban is perhaps best well known in dance circles as inventing a kind of notation for recording dance choreography, which he called Laban notation, so that different works of dance art could be passed down generation to generation, and different choreographers could put on basically the same dance. So, but before that, Laban worked as an efficiency expert in factories, trying to understand how people move through space, using concepts like force and tempo and direction, etc., etc. And one of the qualities that he believed he observed was something that he called flow. And he made an interesting distinction between what he called bound flow and fluent flow. And fluent flow is really what we're going to spend most of our time trying to understand at this level of training. So fluent flow is motion where flow is evident. You can see it, as in a body moving smoothly from point A to point B. Bound flow is deceptive, and to the untrained eye, it might look like a body has stopped moving, but there is a distinction between actual interruption of flow and bound flow. Because bound flow is actually more like the coiling of a spring, where all the energy is captured and bound up like potential energy. And fluent flow is like the spring releasing and going into motion, releasing all the kinetic energy. The next set of terms comes to us from the science of fluid dynamics, which is a branch of physics that studies the properties of liquids or granular solids like sand or ball bearings or something like that. In fluid dynamics, we learn a term called laminar flow. And laminar flow is fluent type flow that is steady and smooth. In the most common physics textbooks that talk about fluid dynamics, there's a very common image of a stream of water. A lot of times you'll see the picture in the textbook. And it says that in the stream of water next to the bank, you'll find that water is flowing fairly smoothly and little ripples in parallel to each other, right? Just going very smoothly down the stream. And this is what they mean by laminar flow. But imagine the water in the middle of the stream, where there are rocks and obstructions and tree branches and whatnot. It bubbles and churns. And in this part of the stream, we see a kind of flow or a kind of movement that we call turbulence. Now, turbulence in actuality is a series of interruptions. And when the water that you see in the middle of the stream is really bubbling and churning, what you're seeing actually is a series of very rapid interruptions, that the water is starting and stopping so fast you can't even see the stop. But what you're seeing is the effects of that start and stop. And that's what we call turbulence. In between turbulence and laminar flow is another state where the water is is going back and forth in between. It's like either becoming turbulent or moving from turbulence back to laminar again. And this is what we call a state of transition or transitional flow. Flow that is either becoming turbulent or becoming laminar. And here we see that picture of the stream and these terms once again. So laminar flow again is like the water at the banks of the stream that's parallel and smooth and just continuous. Turbulent flow is in the middle of the stream where you can see all this chaos happening. And then laminar flow, or then transitional flow is what's happening in between, whether it's either going towards the turbulence or towards the laminar. Now here's the thing that we want to recognize right off the bat. We'll talk about this again in part B when we're talking about assessing and observing flow. And that is that most of the time, especially in the beginning of a new group of students or when you're first beginning as a teacher, most of the time the class is in some state of transition. You get this, that they're moving either towards that chaos, towards that interruption, towards that turbulence, or they're moving back from that turbulence back into laminar flow again. And in fact, you might say that your job as an instructor is to recognize when they're moving towards turbulence, they're in the transitional state, catch them before they get all the way into that chaos, and pull them back towards smooth, laminar, fluent flow again. And then keep them there as long as possible. That's your job. Now, let's see if I can sort of make this a little bit more graphic. Here's a picture of what I call the flow continuum, because flow is not a steady state. It's not a light switch. It's always moving back and forth between these two extremes. On the one extreme, right down, I'm looking at my camera here, at this end of the continuum is what we call non-flow, or complete and total interruption. Here, the flow has stopped. On the other side of the continuum, we would have complete flow, continuity, where it's in motion and not stopping, just on its way. In between those 2 points, however, you'll find a bunch of other states. On the end towards non-flow, my camera's backwards, so when I'm looking at it, it's like I have to figure out where I'm at. On this end of the spectrum of the continuum, where we're entering into non-flow, we see that motion is broken up, right? We see that the continuity, the harmony, the synergy especially, is broken, like it's disconnected. That's what we mean by broken, right? But when we're not quite completely broken, a little bit to the right of that on this continuum, we see turbulence. Here is where it's still moving, it's still in motion, but it's chaotic. It's not anywhere near fluent. To the right of that is a cluster of different states. And you'll see that on the continuum model here, there's the word fluent on the bottom of the arrow. I mean, this is to indicate that all these states here are part of the fluent type of flow. And we can see that there's laminar flow. That's sort of the flow that which is our goal, which we're trying to, get to happen and keep going. But that oftentimes we are in transition, we're in transitional flow. And actually, this is very common, or the most common thing that's happening in our Taiji Fit Flow classes is going back and forth between transitional and fluent. Now, hopefully all that's made sense so far. Now, you'll notice that there's another set of terms above that I'm just introducing right now. My partner, Deanna, doesn't do Tai Chi. She doesn't do Tai Chi Fit. She's beginning to a little bit. She's a psychotherapist and she works with her clients, and sometimes she does a little bit of this kind of movement. She finds it really useful for them. But personally, she's more attracted to dancing. And in fact, she does pole dancing, which is extraordinary. I love to watch when I am given permission to do that. And it's a very lyrical and athletic, kind of dance. And she uses a lot of rhythm. And she says, like a lot of our movement in dance is not laminar, it's not Tai Chi-like at all. You know, it's got passion and motion inside there, different kind of movement, but don't you dare tell me that that's not flow. And so we sat and we talked about it for a long time, and I said, you know, you're right, you're absolutely right. So we had to add another kind of definition here, which we call dynamic and variable flow. So this is flow that may change tempo, sometimes even abruptly, and change direction and change force. And in fact, it turns out that when we really investigate this, there are styles of Tai Chi and the related martial arts that do exactly that. In Chen style, one of the families of classical Tai Chi, its characteristic is this dynamic and variable tempo and expression. So all of this fits in very nicely with their Tai Chi model. And then at the very end of the continuum over there on the right side, you'll see that in complete flow, in complete continuity, what we experience is absolutely effortless. It's effortless in motion, it's effortless in thought, it's effortless in self-consciousness. In other words, there's no inner critic or inner dialogue. It's childlike in a way. And this is what we translate from the Chinese. In Chinese, the phrase is Wu Wei, which means no effort, no trying. It just happens.